I am delighted to welcome you here today. My name is Leslie Thatcher. I'm the Director of Program Development and Strategy here at the Transition Center at Perkins School for the Blind. We are delighted to have a real expert about college pathways joining us today. Her name is Jane Brown, and she's the Director of College Autism Spectrum. She's going to introduce herself with a little more detail in just a minute. But first, we wanted to kind of lay out some of the groundwork for you all who are joining us today about the intersection of this conversation about autism and visual impairment. It's a complex area to discuss, and we want to begin to bring much more depth to this conversation, and Jane is just the person to do that with us. I spend my days thinking about this a lot, and I have a slide up here that explores some of the challenges that our students with visual impairments face. That approximately 42.8% of students who attempt college with a visual impairment don't graduate from college. And we know that some of those individuals might identify as also having autism in addition to visual impairment. We also know that only about 44% of adults with a visual impairment are employed. Many are significantly underemployed. And many of those adults may identify as having autism as well. So we are the folks that we work with, the individuals that you as family members care for, bring a wide range of assets and ideas and lots to bring to both an employment scenario and an educational scenario after high school. But it's a complicated mix for many of our students. When we think of some of the skills that academically may not be addressed in a high school setting, we think of the ability to stick with very challenging topics, things that may be low interest. Jane, I know, is going to talk about that. But for our students who also are learning with a visual impairment, we have a wide range of additional skills our students need to learn to access the material, speed of reading, ways of access materials in different, utilizing different tools such as Braille note takers, but also mainstream devices such as laptops. Those things are directly correlated with both success in school and employment success. But we have to talk about the keys to bringing those dreams to life. And Jane is really a wonderful thinker about these ideas. And we're going to have a bit of a learning experience, but a bit of a conversation. We want to invite you all to post questions in the chat. We'll be monitoring that. I'll work to integrate those into Jane's comments and make sure we have as much time as possible at the end to answer your questions. With that, I'm going to hand the virtual mic over to Jane to introduce herself and begin the presentation.
Thank you so much, Leslie, and thank you for having me tonight. It's an honor to be with all of you, and hopefully I can give you some ideas and add to what you already have as all your infinite expertise on blindness and visual impairment. And I know that Leslie is an excellent resource as far as transitioning out of Perkins into post-secondary education. So we're really going to go through a lot of this together. And I also want to thank Anne Phelan, who brought me over to Perkins. Thank you, Anne. We met at another conference. So I've been in disability services for a long time, for about 45 years. I've only done disability services in higher ed, and I've specialized in working with college students with autism for about 25 years. And so I've seen lots and lots of changes through higher ed and disability services, and of course through technology. And one of the things that a group of us had, about 50 of us had a meeting about last week, is a lot of the different college programs across the country. And that causes a lot of confusion for families and professionals alike. Degree programs are what were used to thinking about for college is when you go to college to usually get a bachelor's degree or sometimes an associate's degree, either one. And for those programs, whether you have a disability or not, you have the same application requirements. Oops, thank you. Um,
Sorry.
that's okay. You're going to apply to the college. You don't have to tell the college that you have any disability. There's no requirement upon application. And if you do tell the college, admissions can't tell anyone else. They can't share that disability information. So it's not as though the college is on notice of a disability at that point. You take the same courses as all students who have been accepted to the program and all students who are studying for the same degree, and you have the same academic requirement. So different than any special education track, you are not going to have modified grades, you're not going to have modified curriculum, you're going to be with everyone else, and you have to request your accommodations. No one is going to come to you and say, do you need extra time for this? You have to go to the Disability Services Office and get that granted for the semester. And then for each exam that you might need extra time, something like requesting a note taker would be for the semester. But if you're asking for extra time for an exam, you have to go and request that for each exam. And the reason for that is wherever your students are now in high school or in a specialized program, your case manager that's working with the student probably has a caseload somewhere between 15 and 25. Is that right, Leslie, for Perkins too?
Well, we have folks on this call from in and outside of Perkins.
Yes.
So I
Mhm.
think that in public high schools, the
Mhm.
caseload may be significantly higher.
Oh,
A primary
really? Okay.
responsibility be attached to a teacher of the visually impaired,
Okay.
and the specialized IEP goals related to an autism diagnosis
Mhm.
would be attached to someone else, but that may be considered a secondary diagnosis
Okay.
in a student's IEP, and the primary diagnosis would be the visual impairment. And often IEP goals are tilted towards that
Of
and
course. Mhm.
to supporting a student to embrace an understanding of that experience, but also the skills that may benefit them as they plan their transition goals. So it's complicated.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
and in Connecticut, in our public schools, the case managers, and in a lot of public schools around the country, case managers have a caseload somewhere between 15 and 30, which is pretty typical for special education students. In college, disability service providers have an average caseload of 150 to 600. So it's very different. And if you're in a typical disability services program somewhere, not a specialized program, then you're not going to see disability services specialists for an hour a week. They don't have that kind of time. And everybody takes multiple courses with multiple exams. So you can see that each disability services person may have 2,000 accommodated exams per semester and can't possibly know when all of them are. So it's part of the student's responsibility within those programs. Now, to move on to certificate programs, if you're going to a post-secondary program that does not have a degree requirement, but may have academic and technical requirements, it may have independent living requirements if you're going away from home. You also may apply very differently to a certificate program than to a degree program. And there may, some of these certificate programs have specialized programs of supports. Some are specific for specific disabilities. Can you go to the next slide, please, Leslie?
But
But for any of these programs, what's important is that we have to think about what those admissions factors are. And we think that it's grades in all the college prep courses and the strength of your curriculum up to now. The admissions test scores, which are changing by the day. Today, Dartmouth just told us they're going to require SAT scores again, and I'm sure there'll be other schools that fall in line. There are still a lot of schools that are making it test optional, but we also think about grades in all the courses. Next slide, please, Leslie. But we actually know it's much more than that. It's really about what I was talking about with self-advocacy. It's that executive function piece, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. And how much can you manage yourself, or how much, parents, are we asking the college or the high school, I'm sorry, to help our student manage our student? And how much are they learning to manage themselves? I say all this from a dual perspective. Leslie mentioned that I work with college students with autism, and that I have worked in colleges. However, I also am a parent of a 32-year-old who is severely autistic, did not go to college. He's also ID. We're actually a Fragile X family. And that makes a difference in the way I look at all of this, because I look at, if my son were going to college, what would have needed to be done in order to get him ready? And some of the students that I work with, they're getting more services than my son did in high school, and they're expecting to go to college. And that concerns me, because I know that without these three things, the self-advocacy, executive function, and self-management, it's very difficult to make that transition. Next slide, please. So for self-advocacy, we really want students to know their strengths and weaknesses and understand what works for you, and to be able to speak up for yourself, and not just have mom or dad or a teacher speaking up, and to push your envelope a little. One of the things that I notice with students that are either blind or visually impaired, we really depend on the student to know what technology works for them. They are the expert in their particular vision issue. And we know that there's a lot of technology out there which many of us in disability services are familiar with, but we want the student to tell us what they need. Leslie, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Oh my, yeah, I could say a few things
Do
about
you want to
that
do
too.
6 hours on that for us, Leslie?
I'll limit my comments. It's an interesting comment you make. We do expect, once a student is in that college environment where the student is the one who requests accommodations and so on, there is an assumption that they can describe the accommodations they need, extended time, perhaps documents or textbooks in a particular format, like it may be a PDF format or a digital format, or a format that they can access on their particular preferred device. But the key in that assumption is that the students have learned how to utilize those tools to promote the efficiency in accessing information, particularly in the degree programs Jane was talking about, that require, to get financial aid, full-time enrollment, which is 4-ish courses at a time in most settings, working with many different online platforms, different types of information coming at students. And so the technology is a really interesting challenge our field faces in terms of empowering students with those tools early, so they're digital natives. I interestingly just got off the phone prior to this webinar with some colleagues in Australia who just completed a PhD thesis exploring successful employment for individuals with visual impairment. And one of the key factors they found in that research was that in students who were introduced, visually impaired students who were introduced to technology at a very early age, I'm talking pre-K, kindergarten, were much more successful in their employment pursuits than students who were introduced to it in a high school level. It's asking our students to change how they learn in high school when the stakes ramp up, the concepts ramp up, and it's quite a challenge. So I could talk more and more about it. I will pause on that. Suffice it to say, we'd be happy to talk in another session about that ad infinitum. It's very interesting, Heather, and it's a key thing that we've discovered in the research we've done in college success at Perkins is exploring what are the barriers to success for students with visual impairments. And secondary diagnosis, such as autism, is one of the barriers. A lack of understanding of the complexity of learning for a student with a visual impairment is the deepest driver of these barriers. Technology in this world in 2024 is the way our students access information. And so it's a complex intersection of it all. But let's learn more, Jane, about the concepts here, because I think they're powerful concepts that cross diagnoses, cross experiences, and such a powerful message you're bringing. So let's continue on.
And the next slide, please.
That.
So, oh, sorry, I think that's the same words with a picture, so you can skip to the next one. Yes.
Oh, there we go. My favorite topic, executive functioning.
Exactly. So we really want to think about where our students are executive functioning wise. And what we've found post-COVID in higher ed is that everyone is behind with executive functioning because people got so used to being at home and having everything at their fingertips, so to speak, and only learning online, that they really fell behind with how to organize themselves and that self-regulation and time management. But what we really encourage families and teachers is to think about not doing the prompting. We know that all of executive function happens in the frontal lobe of the brain. And we know that most of our students have what we like to call the prosthetic frontal lobe, which is either known as mom, dad, or a teacher who's always saying, did you remember you have a dentist appointment after school? Did you remember your homework? Did you remember to study for that test? Did you bring that quiz sheet home? All of those things are executive functioning that we're doing for the student. And we need to move that, and it's hard as parents and as teachers. That we don't consider it prompting necessarily, and it is. And what happens is if we really want to successfully launch the student to college and later on to work, they have to learn how to do that organization and future planning and time management. And by continuing what we do as family members or teachers, we're really taking that skill away from the student. It's difficult, but we can talk about it more later on, and I can give you some strategies. But let's move to the next slide in the interest of time. So where have families been? We know that some of you got diagnoses really early, whether it's for the visual impairment or autism. Some families very quickly come to grips with the diagnosis, and what I like to say, integrate the diagnosis into the family dynamic. I meet with lots and lots, hundreds of families of students ready to start talking transition out of high school. And unfortunately, many of them still say, well, we've never told our student that they have blank. We didn't want to label them or hold them back. Well, what this does is it means the student knows they're different anyway, but they have no idea why. And often what the student thinks is much worse than what the actual diagnosis is. Some of you had a very easy time getting services because a lot of Massachusetts is excellent in providing those specialized services. Some of you were sent to individualized programs. Others really had to struggle. You may have really had to fight your school district. I know there might be other people that are from other places besides Massachusetts. And I know that some schools are not used to working with blind or visually impaired students or deaf-blind students. So what happens by nature is parents are advocate and CEO of that student's education. You have to be, we've all had to be for our students with disabilities. However, once that student graduates from high school, they are advocate and CEO of their education. And are we giving students training time to become their own advocate and CEO of their education and their life? And if we're not, what do we do now to help them be prepared? We know in elementary and secondary school, a lot is done for the student. What are we going to do to get them ready to do for themselves? Next slide, please, Leslie. Because everything changes after high school. The laws change, who's in charge changes, because now the student's in charge, not the parents. The expectations and temptations change, but so do the consequences. Now someone is paying for school. And most colleges or certificate programs, after a week or two, there's very little money back. So things change pretty drastically, and the accommodations change drastically. Next slide, please. This is an email that I got from a parent about a year or so ago, maybe a little longer. The only thing I changed was the name of the university. My son is a freshman at State U. He is studying to be a genetic engineer. He has often complained that the teachers are expecting him to do the same course workload that everyone else is. The only other resources that are being offered to him is note takers, he can't always count on that, and taking his tests away from the class with extended time. He has Asperger's and they're wanting him to write the same amount of essays as everyone else, plus keep up on the rest of the course load. How can I get him more help? The disability services there are in agreement with the teachers. Thank you for any help or advice you can give me. This parent did not like my help or advice. The first thing I said to her is, would you hire a genetic engineer who had only taken half the courses or done half the homework? I wouldn't. I don't think anybody would. In college, we cannot modify courses. We can't modify grades. We can't modify courses. You do the same thing everybody else is doing. But many families don't expect that. They expect whatever modifications were happening in high school will continue in post-secondary. Next slide, please, Listen. So who's the driver? What we know is right now the parents or guardians and the teachers and counselors are really driving this education train. But after high school, it's the student. And I love seeing all these happy students gathered somewhere on a pretty quad. Next slide, please. And then Leslie, after the next one, I'm going to ask you to chime in. So these are some challenges that I hear from parents daily. The number one, I'm sorry, and I have to laugh, who is going to wake him up? When people would come to see me at my office at UConn, at University of Connecticut, I would say, and they would ask me who's going to wake their student up. I would say, you know, I have this vision that you think I'm going to put on like a little nightcap and run around campus knocking on doors to wake all the students up that work with me in the office. That's not how college works. If you're waking up your student and they're in high school, it has to stop and they need to learn to wake themselves up, because we haven't found the job yet, whether it's remote or in person, that you don't have to wake yourself up for. There's limited access. The Family Education Right to Privacy Act means that all your students' information at college belongs to the student. And if you sign what's known as a FERPA waiver, what that really means is that we can contact you if there's a medical emergency, but we're not allowed to talk to you without your student present. So the idea of you calling disability services to say, did he show up for his test? Did he get the extra time? Do you know if he used his technology? We can't talk to you. All we can say is, thank you for calling. You need to talk to your student. Some of our students haven't had the social opportunities that typical students have had, so they may be more vulnerable on campus. And sometimes courses are waived in high school, and that is extremely rare in college. In my whole career, I've seen it happen maybe 4 or 5 times, maybe. People want to know if I can make the student do something, like be excited or motivated. And I always say, if you haven't been able to do it in 17, 18, or 19 years, I'm not going to do it in a 14 or 15 week semester. And then people say, gee, maybe we should have gone to the transition program. Leslie, do you want to talk about some of this and in this
Oh
transition?
my. Well, I think it's about moving what I call the locus of control into our students and allowing them, another expression, the dignity of mistakes, right? The dignity of learning from what their particular approach is, to problem solving, to figuring out how to get up early, to wake up to their alarm, whatever the thing is. And it's a difficult transition for families for sure, right? Parents are, I understand, concerned about, well, what if they fail? What if it doesn't work? What if they don't get to class on time? Um, the college environment is one that it's expected that the student is going to engineer that, and certainly employment is. And when we think about growing those young adults, what Jane is describing in her slides and in her words really helps us understand how to grow these young adults to maximize their own potential. And it's painful and it's bumpy and it's messy. But some of these bumps and messes allow that student the opportunity to make informed decisions. And that is where that locus of control moves into them. There's certainly issues related to guardianship, safety issues, and we can unpack that, if that's appropriate. But I do think this is a crucial and very difficult journey for families to let go of some of this control. And that includes paraprofessionals, that includes reducing the support in the high school to begin to model what the challenges may be in a college environment, whether it's taking one class or taking several classes at the same time. We can scaffold out those skill development, and we can scaffold out that student's understanding of what additional challenges are they bringing to that articulated transition goal, and then talk about it. But we have to provide those concepts to them early, to allow them to make their own choices about what they're going to do with themselves. That's another 6-hour lecture I'll hold for
Yes.
later.
We should have had more time for this webinar, Leslie. Next slide, please, and we'll continue.
Oh, let's hold on. There we go.
Okay. Okay. We really need to focus on the student changing their way of thinking instead of them thinking. And I love that picture that the teacher needs to do something, the parents need to, or the counselor to. I need to do it. I need to fill out these forms. I need to make sure that this is in on time, because right now there's just too much dependence. Go ahead. Next.
And Jane, a fun story from one of our former students in one of our Perkins programs, Compass. As he began to understand this difference between the IDEA entitlement programming that he had experienced in high school and when he enrolled in his college, he came to talk to our Compass students the next year, and he said, I came to understand I am my own IEP. And we actually have an article at our College Readiness Resource Center about that. And it was a brilliant journey of moving. That's the epitome of moving that locus of control into that young person, and helping him understand it was his responsibility. And so it's a great way for us as the adults in the scene here on this call to think about moving that locus of control so that student can claim, I am my IEP. And that relates to that Vision Australia research that I alluded to earlier in this call, that the students who met with the most employment success were the ones who had the greatest locus of control ultimately nested in them.
So true. It's so true. And we see it all the time. This is from Kathy Getchell, who's actually the Disability Services Director at Carnegie Mellon. And she explained your role changes from advocating for the student to supporting the student as they advocate for themselves. Your student may find this transition challenging, and so may you. So start early. Remember too, just as Leslie said, that making mistakes, even big ones, is part of the learning process, and you can best support the students by encouraging and supporting them while giving your adult student the space to do things differently or make a mistake. Exactly what Leslie was saying.
So true.
Next
We
slide.
have an article nested at the end of this presentation to introduce you all on the call to that exact idea of moving that from parent support to and advocacy to moving to the student doing that work.
And I like Anne's comment, the dignity of risk. I've been
Yeah.
using this slide for many years to explain to people how different the world is and how we're not thinking about some of these transitions. In high school, our students truly are booked in 12 to 14 hours a day between the 5 or 6 hours of school for the day, and we hope they're doing at least 2 hours of homework. They've got a lot of frequent quizzes and non-cumulative tests, and most of the teaching comes from a textbook. Most of your students are in classes of 20 to 25, maybe 30 students in one building, depending on what state you're in listening to us this evening. But after school, you've got the activities, you've got therapies, you've got tutoring, you've got so many appointments. And then by the time the student comes home, we hope unwinds a little bit, does some homework, it's time to go to bed and start all over. You've now taken this 12 to 14 hour day and you move to college where you've got structured 12 to 14 hours a week. Most students take 4, some 5, which I don't recommend. I recommend any student with a disability start with no more than 4 classes, and 3 if you can, if you're allowed to go part-time at whatever institution you choose. We hope that students are doing at least 2 hours per day of work in the classes for every hour they're spending in the classroom. You might have 2 or 3 cumulative exams per semester. And the difficulty here is with the structure of only having 12 to 15 hours a week of classes. This individual has to figure out, when do I study? When do I go to tutoring? When do I go to my teacher to get some help? When was that professor's office hours? Because now in each class, research may be necessary, and you may have many primary sources because you have to integrate the slides that the professor may have shared that they're showing in class, the notes that you've taken from class, the notes that you've taken from your reading, plus all the readings that you've done. So it's very different, and you may have anywhere from 10 students in a discussion group to 300 students in a lecture hall, and you may have to get to the entire campus. And if you're on a larger campus, you might have to take transportation to get from one place to another. Now we take the next big leap from college to work. And this says, whoop, the wrong list got copied, and I didn't pick it up when I was proofing. So, but I pretty much know it by heart. Now you've got an 8-hour day. You have usually no more than 2 or 3 weeks off the whole year. No summers off anymore. That shocks students when they say, but I have to go to work. What do you mean 2 weeks off? I always have, right after Mother's Day until September off. Well, not anymore. Now you're working full time. Now you're going to have very frequent feedback. You may have multiple supervisors or just team members that are giving you feedback during the workday, and you have to be able to accept that and maybe adjust. And you always have to be able to work with a group. There are rarely any jobs anymore that you only work by yourself. Some are remote, but a lot of them are at the most now hybrid. So it's a very different world. We'll correct that before, hopefully for the tape, so that we can get the right list there. Next slide, please, Leslie. So what we've found after 20 years of research, that we really looked at what is important for college success. And we talked to hundreds and hundreds of students and faculty and staff. And what we found is that resilience was really the number one thing for college success. And then social communication and interaction. Can you do something like walk up to another student and say, I was sick and missed class yesterday. Can I share your notes? Or can you say to the professor, I didn't understand this. Can you explain it to me? That's a social interaction. And then executive function, then self-regulation. And after those four came academic ability. And as so many parents say to me, oh, but you don't understand how bright my student is. Yes, and that's important, but there's many other things that are equally or more important in order to be successful, both at college and at work. I have a few things in the next few slides to go through resilience, but if Leslie, if we're going to be sending people the slides in the interest of time and being able to have conversation, shall we skip
Yeah,
these few?
sure. Yeah. You tell me when. I'm going to hop through
Just,
resilience.
yep, just that and the next one. Yep. Now let's note the one just before. Let's talk
Oh,
about
you, ooh,
fading or eliminating accommodations. And I think this is important because so many of our students get these intense accommodations, and we really have to talk about them. The number one thing, this is my pet peeve. Please, if you've got a high school student, please stop the study guides. So many students, when they come to college and they're having trouble, my first question to them is, explain to me how you study. And when they say to me, I get a study guide, I memorize it, I get an A. Honestly, I want to tear my hair out and I want to shake all the educators and say, what are we doing to these students? Um, Study guides end at high school. If they're given in high school, many school districts have totally eliminated them and will not allow students to get study guides unless they are serious accommodations for an IEP, because study guides take away the opportunity to learn how to study. There's somebody telling you this is what you need to know for the test. So study guides, if you can eliminate them, it will help your student while they have access to all those good special educators. It will help them learn how to study if they're going to be continuing on. Retaking tests is not an accommodation in college. There are no do-overs. What we always say is do-overs are for kickball. You don't get to retake a test in college. There's many schools now that are using something called the mastery model. Um, that doesn't exist after the high school diploma, and we're finding students with the mastery model haven't learned how to study, and they're not being successful in high school. They're being successful, I'm sorry, in college. Um, Extended or no deadlines. What I mean by that is by law in college,
Mm.
we're not allowed to give a blanket accommodation for all classes to just say there's no deadlines. So that if a student in high school has been getting an accommodation of not having to meet the deadlines for homework or for assignments, that doesn't exist in college because many courses have assignments that are built on one another. And it's impossible, it's fundamentally altering the curriculum, which we're not allowed to do for disability accommodations. There are some classes where you can, and that for certain assignments, you can get an extra 24 or 48 hours, but it's not going to be just a blanket accommodation. One-to-one aids is always an interesting conversation. Um, there's a couple of things. Number one, 99.5% of the institutions will not allow an aid in a classroom unless it's for health and safety. If somebody has a trach, or if somebody has oxygen, or if somebody has uncontrolled seizures, something like that. Otherwise, aids are not allowed in a college classroom, and it's the things that have been tested in courts have been saying, you know, if a student um, cannot behave or focus to be in a classroom without adult support, are they otherwise qualified to be there? There are some specialized programs that even have in their application, if you have needed a one-to-one aid in the last 2 years of high school, you're not qualified for this program. So you want to be really careful if your student is applying to programs to make sure what the requirements are. An accommodation of no group work really doesn't help your student if they're moving on to college. You may think it helps them grades wise, but what it does is take away the opportunity to try and learn how to work with a group, because group work is not going to be waived in college, and many curriculum are based on group work. So again, you want to, what I always say to families I'm working with is, you don't want, your student doesn't want to look at what they need to get into college. They want to look at what they need to get out of college. You wouldn't want them to go to any college they couldn't graduate from. So you have to look at, not only is it the right school, does it have the right academics, but is it someplace that my student can handle the curriculum? Because if it's, there are several colleges that the entire curriculum and all the courses is based on group work. If your student doesn't do well in group work, that's not the right school. The reason I include all homework done in school is absolutely an executive function piece. There has to be a time when the student is not in a structured learning environment where the student has to figure out where and how they can get their homework done. That's an important thing to practice prior to launching, because at college, they're going to need to have all that unstructured time to figure out when to do homework. And a lot of our students say, oh, I have so many study halls, I get everything done. Well, is there a teacher there helping you? Oh yeah, there's a teacher right there and they help me when I'm stuck. That's going to be a problem when the student moves on. So you want to start saving some of that homework for when they're at home. I know that's a lot, and I know that makes some of you nervous. You're not going to do all this at once, and you're going to fade these. You're not going to eliminate everything at once. You want them to do a good transition into high school, and then really start pulling things back so that they can function on as little accommodation as possible. Okay, next slide, Leslie. Unless, do you want to comment on some of these?
The one that I would like to comment on briefly is just the one-to-one aid, beginning to build that student's ability to do independent work. I also wanted to address Jillian's good question about, actually, Jillian, I'm going to put you on hold. The question about mastery, I think would be relevant in this context. There were a couple of folks in the chat who wanted to understand what the mastery model is.
Oh, okay. The mastery model that some school districts use is that if your student takes a quiz or a test and doesn't do well, they can take it again until they have mastered the material. And there are entire school districts that are doing this. And when I talk to the students, because I work as a transition consultant in a local school district, and what the students tell me is, oh, if I'm busy or if there's a game at night or something, I just take the test and I know that I can, I can retake it if I don't like the grade. So that you never have to figure out how to prioritize, because you just choose to do what you want when you want. I asked some of the AP students, the students taking advanced placement courses for college credit, if they used mastery. And they said, oh, sure, we all do, because we know exactly what we need to do in order to be able to retake the test. We have to get an 85 or less. And my face dropped, like, an 85, that's a good grade. Well, no, we know if we get like an 82, we can retake it. So if I don't have enough time to study, I just make sure I get, below an 85 so that I can then study and get, an 95 or a 98. So it's really just teaching students how to work the system rather than, here's your obligations, let's learn how to meet them. And students don't get an opportunity to learn any of that because they don't have to with mastery. They just and they can keep retaking a test or a quiz until they're happy with the grade.
And that ties, Jane, so nicely into the idea of time management, executive functioning, prioritization, which are all executive functioning skills that are assumed or established in when a student arrives in higher education. There's an assumption in mainstream programs that those skills are evolved and established. And as I said in a prior comment in this conversation in the chat, that those skills for students with visual impairments are often are missed often because they're learned incidentally.
Yes.
And they may be lacking the technology skills to record a to-do list, to track it every day, to create rituals and routines because some other adult has externalized that executive functioning. And so when we begin to make a plan early in high school for a fade out of those one-to-one services, or to create opportunities for students to learn skills related to what Jane's talking about, we can then begin to see what those upper limits may be for some students, or when given the opportunity to learn from mistakes, unexpected upper limits of capacity and independence that we may not understand until a student has a chance to experience that and make their own decision about how they're going to respond to it.
Let's talk about the legal piece just briefly.
Yeah,
The next
absolutely.
slide, please. Um,
Oops, hold on.
that's okay. Take your time. Take your
There
time.
you
Thank you. I'm just going to do this briefly. I think a lot of you already know this, but just very briefly, IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This is a federal law of educational entitlement, which guarantees FAPE, a free and appropriate public education. The responsibility is the parent and the school, and it ensures success, meaning no one can flunk out of special education. It's based on evaluation, remediation, and special accommodations, and you have to have a diagnostic label in one of the 13 federal categories. You get your high school diploma, you move on to the adult world, which includes college, of the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the Amendments Act of 2009. This is no longer federal law of entitlement. This is civil rights statute of eligibility. And now the student is responsible. It's hard for the parents to imagine their 18-year-old being responsible, or 22-year-old being responsible for their education, but they are, and we talk directly to the student. What we ensure is not success, but equal access to programs and services based on reasonable accommodations with level of functional impairment in a major life activity. These are totally different laws, and thus the accommodations are very different in college than they are in high school. But for all of you that are here tonight, you're getting this information ahead of time. Way too many families send their students to college not knowing of these differences, and just imagine that the accommodations that the student got in high school are going to continue on, and they can't because the laws are different. So next slide, please.
go.
And we may want to, I'm just going to talk about this briefly because I really want to leave some time for questions, and we have a hard stop in 10 minutes, Leslie, is that correct?
Roughly, yeah.
Okay. We know that anxiety is a huge part of any family that has a family member with a disability, and also any student who is living with a disability. But we know that anxiety really interferes with a lot of coping in college. And so what we really encourage is that students have some active strategies, that they know what it feels like when they're anxious, that they know some things they might do, that they keep working with a therapist if they have a therapist. We find that especially for students with visual impairments and students with autism, or both, finding a therapist who understands how to work with someone with both of these types of challenges is unique. And if you have a therapist that has that specialty, you don't want to lose that person. So often when the student goes to college, they continue meeting with that therapist either in person um, or remotely. And many of our students now continue a therapeutic relationship remotely. Thank goodness we have that capacity. Next slide, please. Our students are dealing with a lot of stress, and we really want the student to understand that they need to figure out how they're going to deal with things. I usually use this age-old stress thermometer and say to students, okay, let's talk through some things that might happen and you tell me how you're going to feel about it. You get to your classroom and you see that there's a note that says your class has been moved for the day to another building. Um, are you going to be able to deal with that? No, I would panic. What if I don't know where the building is? What if I don't know? Okay. You need to do an assignment for the day and you get there and you read the wrong assignment. How are you going to feel? I want to know how students are going to deal with that kind of stress before it happens so that you can start talking about problem solving. But again, it's coping strategies. Next slide, please, Leslie. So what do I need to do? Students need to learn about their disability, and too often as parents, we want to take on that responsibility and not encourage our students to do that. So we want students to learn about themselves, ask questions, to find a community, find resources on campus, but also find a mentor and use their passions. It's amazing to watch students bloom once they've found a community, whether it's other people who have visual impairments, other people who are sighted, other students who have different disabilities, but watching our students find their people and find their passion is a really exciting thing. Next slide, please. I think we're right at the end.
Yeah.
We've talked a little bit about self-regulation, and so I won't go over a lot of this, but we really want to think about things like, okay, what do you have to do before you play your video games? Can you study for half an hour? Can you finish the Common App? Can you write a draft of your essay? That delay of gratification is really important, not only for college, but for work. You know, can you get through another 3 hours of work before you go home and not just ignore your job? Um, okay, next slide, please, because otherwise we will run out of
You're
time.
doing great, Jane.
Thank you. The motivation really has to come from within. We talk to way too many students that are struggling, and when I finally say to a student, "Do you want to be here at college?" "No, but my parents are making me." It doesn't work. You know, the student really has to want to be there. So you have to find, if your student is fascinated with mythical creatures or with Greek mythology or with chess or whatever it is that the student loves, find that and find the college that has a major in that, and let the students study that for a while, knowing that they can't just study their favorite things. They have to do the general ed curriculum too. But it's important to know that they can take one course in what they love and then get some of their requirements out of the way. So you have to break things down and use little rewards. You know, if you get all your work done, we'll go to that Pokemon festival this weekend or whatever it might be that your student loves. Next slide, please. We can talk a lot about social issues. I'm going to skip this for now because Leslie, I think that's another hour webinar. So I think um, so again, your student needs to wake themselves up. They need to run their own IEP meetings. I love what Leslie said. The student is their own IEP. Let them schedule their own appointments, please. If they need a haircut, if they need to go to the doctors. I know it's easier for us. I used to do it too. You'd make the phone call and make all the appointments at once. But once the student goes to college, even if they need to see someone like me, it's rare nowadays to be able to walk in and have an appointment. You have to call and make an appointment in order to see someone. Don't make that another thing students have to learn once they've gone to college. So refilling their own meds, it's easy to do now over the phone. Make sure students can do it. They should not be relying on mom and dad to refill meds. Using a calendar and a time management system, and please let your students at least volunteer or have some sort of job experience prior to leaving high school. So many of our students with disabilities are behind in the work world because they've never had that first kind of job. Volunteer is fine. Walk dogs at a shelter or play music at a nursing home, whatever it is, but something that you have to have a boss that's not mom or dad. And if needed, take an independent living skills class. Sorry, I'm speed talking now, so we have some time. I apologize.
It's okay.
We know that successful students, as Leslie has mentioned, understand and accept their disability. They know what works. They have some good skills and they're internally motivated and they become excellent self-advocates. They may not be when they first come to us as first-year students, but they become very good advocates. And we have to remember, it's not about just the college degree or certificate. Our goal for all these young people is an independent, successful adulthood, and all that that encompasses, hopefully a career they love, hopefully relationships and friends and a community. And that's what's important. And if that includes some college or a degree, wonderful. But it's not just the degree that makes a successful person. So now we can get to some questions. So are there questions in the chat or are we going to do it?
No, there's no questions to lead in now. I think there may be an opportunity, Jane, just to mention, there was a question about programs for students with IDD and how those contrast with autism. And I mean, that's one of the glorious things about the state of colleges right now is there's intentional programming designed to meet different needs.
Yes, I think that's true. As of last week, which means I must update my website. As of last week, there are 128 specialized programs in colleges for students with autism. Those are degree-seeking programs, not necessarily for students with ID or not necessarily certificate programs. Those are separate. For students with ID or CTP programs, college transition programs, there is a wonderful website that many of you probably know about called thinkcollege.net, run by the Center for Community Inclusion at UMass Boston. And they have a wonderful, robust website that you can put in what you're looking for, commuter or residential and 4-year or 2-year, and it will give you a list in every state in the country of all those ID programs. The autism programs, we have a list on our website, collegeautismspectrum.com. There's several others. Ours are just degree seeking programs. I like to keep our list separate because I think it's easier for families to know which is which than having to figure out, is this an ID program? Or many of the autism programs are run out of disability services, which means that there will also be specialists on the team that at least understand visual impairment, because in disability services, we need to be somewhat knowledgeable about all those different things that students are coming in for accommodations. So any disability that people have, we have to at least be familiar with in disability services, which is why I mentioned about the technology, because disability assistive technology in general has expanded so much that many larger offices have assistive technology specialists. And the visual impairment technology is even more specialized. And some of the accommodation specialists are wonderful, and others need the students to come in and say, this is exactly what I use. This is the screen reader I use. This is, you want people that are at least a little bit familiar so that we can make sure that the students' technology will match with our portal systems so that they can upload materials and hand in assignments, because all of that now is done online.
Yeah, such a great point. I'm going to pop over to our a couple other screens here, Jane.
Okay.
On that topic, we have in our resources, we have something called the College Readiness Resource Center, which is linked in this presentation. It's a robust range of articles and webinars and checklist, college readiness checklist that we've created to kind of begin to unpack this for students with visual impairments, to begin to really give tools to students and families to help them understand the unique needs and the unique demands that when we say, I want to go to college, what that might mean. So a couple of articles we pulled out specifically from Parent Advocate to Partner, the ADA versus IDA spells it out. And another article that was kind of fun to write was why we don't have a list of colleges for students with visual impairment, because it's complicated. If you picked up on anything from this presentation, I hope that you did that. There's probably about 60 plus other resources within the College Readiness Resource Center designed by audience for families, for students, and for educators. We have articles about executive functioning. I think we have a 4-part series on that. We have note taking, technology, and a million other things. So, and then Jane's website is also linked in this resource page, just so you know that's a beginning place to start. And then finally, we have, not finally, this is a wonderful news. We have a really important webinar coming up next month, March 5th, from 6:30 to 7:30, a comprehensive guide to guardianship. And I think you'll be surprised at the range of options that are emerging in this 2024. And so I really encourage you, even if you think this may not really apply to me, it's good. It may be good to know, even if you might be on the cusp of thinking about this. It's a really important topic that I encourage you to join. And finally, a contact list of the folks who helped make this happen, and Phelan, who invited Jane here to speak with us tonight, Janine Brennan, who's the brains behind the whole webinar. General questions can be sent to transition@perkins.org, and Alex Lavoie is director of the Transition Center. And we're just delighted to have you all here and to have Jane join us and bring her wisdom to this conversation. So more to
Thank you.
come.
Also, families can contact me either through my website. There's a contact on our website, and the info@collegeautismspectrum.com comes to me, or jane@collegeautismspectrum.com.
Awesome.
It's a I read, I didn't read all of the chat yet. I'm going to have to go back and read it, but I did read one piece that someone has autism and a visual impairment, but that visual impairment was picked up late because everything was attributed to the autism. I see that over and over again with so many issues with young people, that everything is attributed to the autism. And so many other things are missed. And then someone is starting later to learn everything they need to about that that co-occurring disability. So I think it's really important for people to be aware of those types of things and make sure that they're advocating and attending evenings like tonight to learn some information. But thank you so much for having me. I appreciate all of you taking the time, and I appreciate being invited to share some information. Are there other questions? That I don't have the chat open.
I'm monitoring. Got 2 more messages here. No more. Oh, it will be recorded. They appreciate lots of nice comments. So no particular questions, but that's why the Transition Center is here, Jane. And for families, that we're here to support you. Email the Transition Center at Perkins, or transition@perkins.org, and we can help get you to the right person to help you unpack some of these complexities. So have a good night, and thank you for joining us. Thanks, Jane.
Thank you.
It was really fun.